Video and Oversight and Accountability will come to order. I want to welcome everyone here today. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. 3.5 years ago, when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris took office, they promised to build back better. The fawning media told us that the adults are back in the room. But 3.5 years later, the economy is suffering, the border is broken, and crises continue to erupt worldwide. Everything Joe Biden and Kamala Harris has touched has failed. Americans are asking themselves, what is better? The evidence of President Biden and Vice President Harris's incompetent and weak leadership is seen and felt by Americans across our nation. Let's look at the economy. Vice President Harris has claimed repeatedly that Bidenomics is working and is a term we are proud of. Yet Americans have faced 20% average inflation since Joe Biden and Kamala Harris took office. The price of everything has gone up. More Americans are now having to choose whether to pay their energy bill, pay rent, or buy food. How is this record something to be proud of? These price increases aren't transitory at all, as one of Biden-Harris administration officials claimed. American households must now spend over $11,000 more each year just to maintain the same quality of life. Let's turn to our broken border. On their first day in office, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris immediately enacted policies that eroded border security, overwhelmed law enforcement, and left us vulnerable to terrorist infiltration. They ended the Remain in Mexico program, stopped construction of the border barrier system, and gutted interior enforcement against illegal aliens. They signaled to the world our border was open. Finally realizing it was turning into an inconvenient problem, President Biden tapped Vice President Harris to examine the root causes of the border crisis that happened on their watch. Did she bother to examine her own administration's policies fueling the crisis? Clearly not. In fact, since Joe Biden and Kamala Harris took office, over 7 million illegal aliens were either released into the country or evaded apprehension entirely to make it here. And instead of being given swift due process and deportations, the Biden-Harris administration flew these illegal aliens all over the country, paying hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars to non-government organizations and to provide food, shelter, and other services. Communities across our country are suffering from the Biden-Harris open border. Meanwhile, the Biden-Harris administration grossly mismanages the very government programs they champion. Congressional Democrats committed $5 billion in 2021 to build electric vehicle charging stations. You know how many the Biden-Harris administration built? 8. Not 8,000, not 800, 8. That's $625 million per charging station. $42 billion is spent on their broadband equity access and deployment program to connect Americans to high-speed internet. Over 1,000 days later, this program has not connected a single American to the internet, not one. $42 billion for internet, not a single American's been connected in that program. Meanwhile, American taxpayers who are already struggling with sky-high inflation are on the hook to pay for the Biden-Harris administration boondoggles. The Biden-Harris administration's incompetence has extended to the world stage, contributing to chaos extending across the planet. Instead of the adults in the room, the American people continue to bear the consequences of weak and effective leadership on the global stage. The disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, where a failure to plan created the conditions ripe for a terrorist attack that killed 13 service members and scores of Afghan civilians. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the emboldening of Iran and its proxies, and growing political warfare by the Chinese Communist Party. These are just a few examples of the Biden-Harris administration's failed policies. Americans cannot afford more of them. The Oversight Committee has been vigilant this Congress to uncover what works, what doesn't, and how to move forward as this administration has drifted from crises to crises. We know that border walls work because we heard it firsthand from Border Patrol experts and Border Patrol agents. We know the solution to inflation is to get spending under control and roll back overreaching and costly regulations that will only be passed on to consumers. We know that strong leadership on the world stage is necessary to confront aggression by foreign powers aligned with evil terrorists. The Oversight Committee looks forward to hearing from the witnesses today on more solutions to the problems our country now faces because of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's failed policies, ineffective, incompetent, and weak leadership. Thank you to the witnesses appearing here today, and I now yield to the ranking member for his opening remarks.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for joining us today for one of the committee's last hearings in the 118th Congress with the extremely fitting title of A Legacy of Incompetence. The majority has assembled a group of leading Project 2025 intellectuals for a Project 2025 coming out party today. The witnesses will advertise their wares, which almost makes me a bit nostalgic, Mr. Chairman, for the days when our colleagues said that they were pursuing President Joe Biden for the worst presidential crime in American history, a crime which unfortunately they were never able to identify, but which they now appear to have dropped completely. So last week, my Democratic colleagues and I urged the chairman to hold a hearing on a real issue, on the gun violence epidemic that is ravaging American communities. This Congress, our colleagues have refused to hold a single hearing about a single mass shooting except for the one that involved former President Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. The security of the former president is absolutely critical, but doesn't the rest of the country count too? Who's going to keep the rest of America safe from AR-15 attacks by disturbed people loaded up on hate and conspiracy theory? Don't all Americans deserve to live free of gun violence? There have been more than 1,000 mass shootings defined as at least 4 people being shot that have claimed more than 1,000 lives since the start of this Congress. Just since the mass shooting and assassination attempt on the ex-president on July 13th, there have been more than 100 additional mass shootings that have claimed 88 more American lives. There were 4 other Americans who died that day on July 13th after the attack in Butler. And yet we're told by J.D. Vance that gun violence is a, quote, fact of life in America. C'est la vie. Nothing can be done about it. Of course, it's not a fact of life in England or France or Ireland or Canada or Japan or dozens of other countries. The NRA, the GOP, and the terribly weak Swiss cheese gun laws they insist upon have made gun violence a fact of death in America because they refuse to discuss the policy solutions favored by the vast majority of the American people of all parties: a universal violent criminal background check, red flag laws, a ban on the sale of AR-15s and other military-style assault weapons. So we have a rate of gun homicide 25 times higher than people living in Europe. And gun violence is now the leading cause of death for children and teenagers in the United States of America. Yet instead of holding a hearing on gun violence, we've convened a panel of 4 witnesses with deep ties to Project 2025, the MAGA manifesto for a second Trump term, so they can audition for Mr. Trump's approval and land a spot on his cabinet or sub-cabinet, a fate not necessarily to be envied if you talk to former Vice President Mike Pence or Trump's former Defense Secretary Mark Esper or his former National Security Advisor John Bolton or Cassidy Hutchinson or more than 100 other former Republican officials declaring Donald Trump completely unfit for office. But here we are with these Project 2025 luminaries who've taken up the challenge to set forth the agenda on how to take America backwards in every domain of public life. A recently disclosed email from Stephen Bradbury, one of Project 2025's leaders and Trump's former Secretary of Transportation, says that, quote, those who show real commitment and valuable contributions will be recognized by the leaders of the Project 2025, whose recommendations are likely to carry influence with the key personnel decision makers. And today, 2 of our witnesses, Mr. CARR and Ms. Sakura, showed just that real commitment by authoring chapters of Project 2025. Press reports say Mr. CARR is vying to be Mr. Trump's FCC chairman, while Ms. Gunasekera apparently has her eye on becoming Mr. Trump's next EPA administrator. And I will stand corrected if you guys disclaim any ambitions for those offices, but that's what the press is reporting. The majority's other two witnesses also come to us from organizations that are right there on the advisory board of Project 2025. So we'll hear from them and we'll discuss how they intend to implement the extremist Project 2025 game plan in a hypothetical second administration for Donald Trump. It's a program that depends on sending in an army of Trump sycophants and loyalists to replace 50,000 professional civil servants. It's a program subordinating the people's government to big corporations, and it tramples the civil rights and liberties of women to abortion, birth control, and IVF, which the Republicans just voted against yesterday. It's a plan to upend democratic government as we know it, and it involves politicizing the federal workforce and gutting the professional civil service, weaponizing the Department of Justice against political rivals and the people, seizing political control of independent agencies like the Federal Reserve Board and the FCC, eliminating overtime pay for millions of workers, denying the climate crisis and pulling the plug on environmental progress, ending reproductive freedom in every state, federally surveilling births and abortions, legalizing discrimination against LGBTQ Americans, organizing mass deportations and detention camps, deploying the military to quash free speech and protests, eliminating Head Start and the Department of Education, dismantling NOAA and privatizing the National Wealth Service, limiting benefits for veterans. Now, Donald Trump has half-heartedly tried to distance himself from this toxic and increasingly unpopular agenda, but you need only to turn to the table of contents of this big book to realize it is the total product of Trump's inner circle. The MAGA Manifesto has 37 authors and contributors. Of those, 31 served in Trump's administration, 80%. Donald Trump has turned dodgy about his connection to Project 2025, despite the fact that he has praised it and commended its authors, because he knows it is way too extreme for the vast majority of the American people. The Biden-Harris administration has restored America's place as a global leader and led an economic recovery that is the envy of the rest of the world. Project 2025 wants to reverse all the progress we've made, strip Americans of basic fundamental rights and freedoms that we've had for decades, and create a federal workforce loyal only to Donald Trump and not to the Constitution of the United States. Today, Mr. Chairman, we're going to try to get to the details from these Project 2025 experts that you have kindly assembled for us. Let's get specific today, and let's see if the American people really want to follow
my best here. I think my counterpart may have butchered it too, and I'm going to do my best. Mandy Gunasekera.
Gunasekera.
Yeah, is former chief of staff at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under Administrator Andrew Wheeler, where she set and implemented environmental policy priorities for the Trump administration. She's an environmental attorney and has significant experience in both the legislative and executive branches related to energy and environmental regulations and policy. Finally, Skye Perryman is president and CEO of the nonprofit Democracy Forward. She was recently named by Washingtonian magazine one of the most influential people shaping policy in 2024. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witness is answered in the affirmative. Thank you all. We appreciate so much you being here today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statement and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral statements to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes have expired, and we would ask that you please wrap up. I now recognize Mr. CARR for his opening statement.
Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Raskin, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify. I've had the privilege of serving as a commissioner on the FCC for over 7 years now. Before that, I served as the agency's general counsel after first joining the FCC as a staffer back in 2012. My primary focus has been ensuring that every American has a fair shot at next-generation connectivity. In my view, there's no better way to do a job in Washington than to get outside the Beltway and see firsthand the challenges ahead. That's why I spent time in nearly every state over the past few years, meeting with broadband builders, local leaders, and community members alike. Along the way, I've stood on top of a 2,000-foot broadcast tower with tower crews. I've been a mile below ground to see a fiber build connecting an underground research lab. I've visited with crews stringing fiber along the Arctic Ocean in Utqiagvik, Alaska, America's northernmost point. And I've been on the Gulf Coast with teams as they restored service after hurricanes in Florida. In every community, I've heard about the opportunity that comes with a high-speed connection. And that's why I was pleased when a bipartisan consensus emerged to provide the support necessary to end the digital divide. The most significant of those efforts is a $42 billion initiative known as BEAD. But unfortunately, BEAD is a program that has gone off the rails. Here's how. In 2021, Vice President Harris agreed to lead the administration's signature $42 billion effort to extend internet service to millions of Americans. It's now been 1,039 days since that program was enacted. After all of that time, not one person has been connected to the internet. Not one home, not one business. Not even one shovel worth of dirt has been turned. And it gets worse. No infrastructure builds will even start until sometime next year at the earliest, and in many cases, not until 2026. This makes Vice President Harris's $42 billion initiative the slowest moving federal broadband deployment program in recent history. With Vice President Harris at the helm, Politico recently reported on the, quote, frustration in finger pointing that defined the program's, quote, messy, delayed rollout. One state broadband official described, quote, a chaotic implementation environment, dysfunction, delays. She added that the administration, quote, has provided either no guidance, guidance given too late, or guidance changing midstream. The administration, she said, is slowing states down. So what has the administration been doing over the last 1,039 days instead of connecting Americans? It's been advancing a wish list of progressive policy goals. The $42 billion program led by Vice President Harris is being used to push a climate change agenda, DEI requirements, price controls, preferences for government-run networks, and rules that will lead to wasteful overbuilding. All of this will leave rural communities behind. Frankly, it would not be the only time the Biden-Harris administration has left rural America behind. In 2020, the FCC secured a commitment from Starlink to provide internet to 640,000 homes and businesses for about $1,300 per location in federal support. But the government revoked that award last year after President Biden gave agencies the green light to go after Musk. The administration is now spending dollars on the penny to connect locations through its own initiatives. Senator Cruz released a report identifying entire projects where the administration is now spending over $100,000 per location for internet. So here's the bottom line. Absent major reforms, Vice President Harris's $42 billion program is wired to fail. It's time to correct course. Get rid of all the extraneous political goals and focus on quickly connecting Americans. In closing, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Krikorian for his opening statement.
Thank you for the invitation to speak.
And Mike, please.
Thank you for the invitation to speak before the committee. I'd like to assure the ranking member I'm not, in fact, auditioning for a job. Don't take this the wrong way, but with regard to immigration, at least, the title of the hearing is a little bit misleading. The Biden-Harris record on immigration is the result of neither incompetence nor failure. The largest border crisis in the history of our country, probably the largest such event in human history, began on January 20th, 2021 on purpose, not due to incompetence. Since that date, there have been more than 10 million encounters of inadmissible aliens at our borders, millions of whom have been and continue to be unlawfully allowed to enter the United States. This did not happen because the Biden-Harris administration and its impeached Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, made mistakes or miscalculations. That would have been bad enough and certainly a proper subject for congressional oversight, but would be excusable because we all have shortcomings, we all make mistakes. Rather, the ongoing border crisis is the result of ideology. There are only two ways of thinking about the immigration issue overall. Either no one in the world is allowed to come here, and then we make limited exceptions, or everyone in the world is allowed to come here with certain limited exceptions. So no one gets to come in with exceptions, or everyone gets to come in with exceptions. The Immigration and Nationality Act, of course, is based on the former perspective. No foreigner has a right to move here, but we, the people, decide there are specific grounds to admit a limited number of people. Maybe they have a relative here or a job skill or what have you. There are different opinions about how to do that, but they all are under one umbrella, basically, that immigration is a privilege granted by the American people. This administration's approach to immigration is based on the second view, the opposite view, that everyone in the world has a right to move here if they choose to do so, and the American people have no right to place limits on immigration apart from those related to basic safety, terrorists, criminals, deadly diseases, and even those limitations are highly circumscribed. Strictly speaking, this isn't open borders, though that description may do as a shorthand. Instead, I would describe the Biden-Harris approach to immigration as one of unlimited immigration that holds that any limits on the level of immigration are morally indefensible, and circumventing those limits by any means available is a moral duty. This is fundamentally contrary to federal law, of course, but also contrary to the Constitution and the very concept of sovereignty and consent of the governed. The fruit of that ideology is spelled out in detail in my written statement. The most common pretext for subverting the will of the people on limits on immigration is asylum, and the chief practical means of achieving unlimited immigration are unlawful releases from detention and unlawful grants of mass categorical parole. This unlimited immigration perspective also requires an inversion of the proper role of the executive. The allocation of authority in the INA is that the President has the power to keep out anyone he thinks should be excluded, but can let in only those who have been specifically authorized by Congress for him to admit. Due to this belief in unlimited immigration, the Biden-Harris administration's understanding is the precise opposite. They have acted for 3.5 years on the belief that the President may let in anyone he wants, but may keep out aliens only for very narrow reasons. Let me close with an example to illustrate this. The CBP-1 parole scheme seeks to funnel through the ports of entry inadmissible aliens who ostensibly otherwise would cross the border illegally. When this unlawful program was started in May 2023, DHS set the limit at 1,000 inadmissible aliens being given interviews per day. The next month, they increased the number to 1,250 a day. Later that same month, they increased it again to 1,450 a day. So it's more than 500,000 inadmissible aliens released into the United States. These numbers have no basis in law, nor did Congress even authorize the President to come up with his own number, as with refugee resettlement. The administration has simply made up numbers for how many inadmissible aliens to admit, based mainly on how quickly they can be processed and released, and feels free to change those numbers at will. This is illustrative of the Biden-Harris approach to immigration, which might be put this way: we can let in anyone we want, in any number, for any reason, and we dare Congress to do anything about it. This is not the way a self-governing people's immigration system should work. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Mobbs for her opening statement.
Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Raskin, and members of the committee, thank you for your leadership in convening a hearing to discuss the policy implications of the current administration. Ranking Member Raskin, I'd like to assure you I'm not seeking an appointment, nor have I even read Project 2025. But the core duty of any government is to protect its citizens. Yet, over the last 4 years, the world has only grown more dangerous. We have witnessed the largest attack on a European nation in 85 years and the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. History has been made by the number of full and partial U.S. embassy evacuations around the world, and the United Nations concurs that, quote, the world is facing the highest number of conflicts since World War II, end quote. It's crucial to understand that these conditions weren't simply imposed on us. Instead, reckless policies of appeasement embolden our enemies, giving them the power and confidence to act. When the world's most powerful democracy projects indecision, it invites aggression. Authoritarian states and hostile non-state actors have sensed a window of opportunity to expand their influence and challenge American power and prestige. The clearest example of such overt aggression by a state actor can be found in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A war that has entered its third year was presaged by a lengthy series of policy decisions by the administration that strengthened Putin's position and demonstrated a provocative unwillingness to defend Ukraine. The end result of these policy choices was the greatest deterrence failure since the Cold War. Once the invasion occurred, the administration continuously slow-rolled critical military aid and a strategy for victory. The Biden-Harris administration's chronic delays project weakness, dragging out the conflict and escalating the economic burden borne by the United States and our allies. It's no surprise that the failed execution of another key policy, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, was overseen by the same team. U.S. intelligence assessed the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan played a major role in influencing Putin's decision to invade. The administration prioritized political timelines over on-the-ground realities. At state, they resisted early calls for a non-combat evacuation, believing it would signal failure. At the Department of Defense, operational mistakes such as the closure of Bagram Air Base severely hindered the U.S.'s ability to conduct a secure evacuation. And despite credible intelligence warning of a terrorist threat, the DoD failed to prevent the deadly bombing at Abbey Gate, which claimed the lives of 13 U.S. service members. To this day, key figures across all agencies have avoided responsibility, and accountability has been notably absent across all levels. Not only did the U.S. government leave behind $7 billion worth of military equipment, which the Taliban just paraded in a celebratory event, but a January report from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction noted since August 2021, the UN has purchased, transported, and transferred $2.9 billion in U.S. currency to Afghanistan. The report also highlighted that the U.S. remains Afghanistan's largest international donor. In short, the U.S. is sending money to the Taliban. Again, it is unsurprising that one of the chief architects of the withdrawal failure also touted that, quote, the Middle East is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades, end quote, only 8 days before the multi-frontal attack launched by Iranian-supported Hamas into Israel. The administration's efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal have been disastrous. Once again, the shift from a maximum pressure campaign under the previous administration to a conciliatory appeasement-based strategy has shown to be catastrophic. In fact, most of Iran's nuclear expansion occurred after President Biden's election. Iran's increasing involvement in regional instability and its military support for Russia underscores the administration's inability to curtail Iran's authoritarian expansion. Just as the Biden-Harris administration has failed to effectively deter our other enemies, he is running the risk of failing to lead against our greatest threat. Now, we have bolstered our alliances. We do have the AUKUS security partnership. We have concentrated bipartisan efforts, which are positive developments. Yet the Biden administration's hallmark embrace of this idea of diplomatic ease with authoritarian leaders, in this case China, runs the risk of tipping us into managing competition rather than winning. The U.S. is in a new Cold War with China, and attempts to temper or tame that reality only increase the likelihood of an actual war. When American foreign policy fails, women and girls often pay the highest price. The United Nations reported a 50% increase in verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence from 2022 to 2023. This violence has had far-reaching societal consequences, severely limiting women's livelihoods and restricting girls' access to education in many countries around the world. This is particularly true in Afghanistan, where, as one young woman described, quote, "Women and girls have lost all their hope in the world," end quote. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not enjoy sitting here reciting a litany of U.S. failures and a decline in America's power and presence on the world stage. I am a proud American who deeply loves her country. Unfortunately, many of the failures outlined here represent systemic breakdowns from the White House to individual agency leadership. There has been a startling lack of accountability, and Americans have taken notice. When accountability is neglected, the consequences are clear and far-reaching. Ultimately, the cost of ignoring accountability is not just organizational inefficiency. Without accountability, the price is eventually paid in the form of deteriorated systems, weakened institutions, deepened crises, and chaos. Tragically, it is Americans who are bearing the burden of these costs. Therefore, it's altogether unsurprising that less than a quarter of the American people trust the government in Washington to do what is right. It is my hope effective and strong oversight can change that for the better. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Now I now recognize Ms. Gunasare.
Gunasekara, thank you.
Say that one more time. It's going to,
It's all right, Gunasekara.
that's what I meant.
That's what y'all said.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Chairman Comer, thank you for being here today. Ranking Member Raskin, it really is an honor to be with all of y'all and fellow members of the committee. I have a prepared opening statement that I'll get into in just a second, but Ranking Member Raskin, you reiterated and have created a boogeyman that just isn't there. I did author the EPA chapter on Project 2025, but in the course of that, I did not work with President Trump, with any of the people who work for him directly or his campaign. And it is very misleading to suggest that there's any coordination there, because I can personally tell you it did not happen. And I am not vying for a position in the next administration. I've actually left DC and I've moved to a small town in Mississippi where I interact every day with people who live outside this bubble of gaslighting and misleading, and they actually are dealing with the consequences caused by policy decisions of this administration that isn't defined by progress, but defined by creating unnecessary hardship. I understand why it's hard to think about the political realm prior to President Trump, but the Heritage Foundation has been very involved in pushing forward conservative policies for quite a while. And the Mandate for Leadership, the latest iteration, it's the 9th edition. This is a project that has been put out every few years since 1981. So it's been around for quite some time, and again, is more committed to representing the position of the broader conservative movement than any one candidate or person. And I understand why there is the creation of this boogeyman, because your leading candidate is one running away from policy actions she has taken that make Americans' lives much more difficult. In fact, Vice President Kamala Harris was recently asked on national television the following question: when it comes to the economy, do you believe Americans are better off than they were 4 years ago? She said a lot of words, but she did not answer the question, because the reality is most Americans are not better off. Most Americans are struggling to deal with expensive gas, expensive electricity, and high-cost goods and groceries that have created financial burdens that Americans have had to deal with throughout the Biden-Harris administration. Their day one energy policies are a key driver behind Americans' increasing financial distress. From President Biden's promise to end all fossil fuels, alongside Vice President Kamala Harris's commitment to ban fracking, Americans have suffered under their radical agenda. From the energy perspective, this has included locking up development of resources and demonizing industries, mainly coal, oil, and natural gas, that still provide 80% of our daily energy needs. A recent report from the Institute of Energy Research has been tracking these actions, and they've found that since January 2021, President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and congressional Democrats have taken over 250 actions that make it harder to produce energy in America. This has included stopping construction of the Keystone XL pipeline that immediately cut 11,000 domestic jobs, including thousands of union jobs, issuing a moratorium on new oil and gas permits on federal lands, greenlighting Putin's Nord Stream 2 pipeline while shuttering the development of U.S. pipelines along the East Coast, rejoining the disastrous Paris Climate Agreement that is squeezing out U.S. jobs and increasing the regulatory burden on American companies, launching a war on household appliances that are now 34% more expensive than 15 years ago, blocking the Twin Metals mine, shuttering U.S. steelworker jobs in Minnesota and cutting off access to critical minerals that we need more and more of, and instead this administration is making us more and more dependent on China. Slowing permits for LNG facilities from an average of 7 weeks to 11 months, then completely halting permits for new LNG facilities altogether. Mandating that Americans drive electric vehicles despite growing market resistance, infrastructure shortfalls, and a preference for more affordable and reliable gas-powered vehicles. Americans are dealing with the consequences of these actions every time they put gas in their car, pay their electricity bills, or go to the grocery store. Now, this isn't necessary for purposes of protecting the environment or saving future generations from climate change. I know this because during the Trump administration, we were able to grow the economy, create jobs, reduce emissions, and address legacy environmental issues. The reality is that America needs more energy, and with the right policies in place and a pragmatic mindset from our leaders, we can build a strong economy that delivers lower cost for consumers, protects the environment, and reverses the negative financial consequences of the past 3.5 years. Again, thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Very good. Thank you. Now I recognize Ms. Perryman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ranking Member, thank you for the invitation to testify here today. My name is Skye Perryman. I'm a lawyer and the president and CEO of Democracy Forward, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes democracy and progress through litigation, regulatory engagement, policy, education, research, and commitment to the rule of law. Democracy Forward has had the privilege of representing clients that make up the very fabric of this country and across the nation, including parents, teachers, workers, small businesses, scientists, veterans, voters, and many more. Our team is committed to our country's founding idea that our government does derive its power from the consent of the governed, and we are dedicated to bringing about our democracy's promise that the government must work for all people. American democracy is at an inflection point, and it is in a crisis that threatens our freedoms. In the months following an attempt by extremists to disrupt the peaceful transition of presidential power on January 6, 2021, the United States was added to a list of global backsliding democracies by the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance. The report noted, and I will quote, "The United States, a bastion of global democracy, fell victim to authoritarian tendencies. Myriad factors have contributed to this, including the rejection of an election result by an incumbent president," scholars have noted, "and an attempted insurrection against this legislative branch." Last year, 13 of our presidential libraries in the United States, from President Hoover's library to President Bush's library to President Obama's library, warned of the fragile state of United States democracy. These threats to our democracy and freedoms enjoyed by the American people are not academic, and they are not hyperbole. In 2022, the United States Supreme Court reversed a federal constitutional privacy protection that had been recognized for nearly 5 decades, leaving women of reproductive age in the United States with fewer rights than the generation just before them. Across the nation, women are living without access to the critical care they need, including in emergency situations. Book bans are on the rise in our nation and communities across the country. Misinformation and disinformation continues to be rampant and perpetuated by far-right groups and political actors, often targeting families and communities, including those that have immigrated to the United States. And political violence that's on the rise, and yes, Mr. Ranking Member, gun violence continues to be a scourge in our education system and across the country. Just 2 years after former President Trump and his allies refused to acknowledge the results of the 2020 election, reports began to surface that the former president and his associates were planning a shadow government and developing extensive policy plans to remake American government as we know it. These and related efforts, including the development of a 922-page document known as Project 2025, have been well documented. Proposals in Project 2025 represent profound threats to the American people, to our freedoms, and to our democracy. Democracy Forward has published a People's Guide to Project 2025 to expose many of the policies that undermine the well-being of the American people, which the authors of the project purport to say a president could do on day one of an administration. Those policies include, but are not limited to, the weaponization of the Department of Justice against the American people, the politicizing of our civil service, undermining the government's ability to work for the American people, enabling discrimination across society, making it harder for Americans to make ends meet, including Americans in rural areas, through taking overtime eligibility away from millions of American workers, denying our climate crisis, undermining and delegitimizing our public education, and failing to address gun violence, child care crisis, and many other crises in this country. Project 2025 is not hypothetical. It and other extreme proposals are already taking hold at the state and community level in many communities across the country and are being pursued in the courts. Anti-democratic actors are using the states to incubate and normalize Project 2025 and other extremist tactics. Many of the same groups that have supported regressions of our federal rights, including the overturning of Roe v. Wade, restricting voting rights, and undermining our government's ability to work for the people, are behind this project. And in many cases, these groups and aligned far-right attorneys generals are seeking to undermine the progress and policies of the Biden-Harris administration in the courts and in communities across the country. It is incredibly important that this Congress understand the threats posed by Project 2025 and the harms of far-right extremism and anti-democratic movements that are afoot in this country. I provide this testimony today and look forward to your questions with the sincere hope that it is through understanding this crisis that we can build for a better tomorrow. I look forward to your questions and thank you for having me.
And let me remind everyone, the purpose of this hearing is to dissect the policies of the Biden-Harris administration. And if there's an opportunity and some want to defend those policies, this is a perfect forum to do that. So again, I look forward to a very substantive hearing, and I'll begin with questions. I recognize myself. Mr. Krikorian, you mentioned what I think is one of the biggest failures in policy of any administration, and that's what the disaster at the southern border. And I know that Vice President Harris has kind of flip-flopped. She even has 4 years ago, she implied that the border wall was racist, and now she's featuring it in campaign ads. One of the first policies enacted was the halting the construction of the border wall. You have stated in your remarks that you believe that was their policy, to have an open border policy. It wasn't incompetence, this was their specific intent. One of the arguments that some of my colleagues make is that there was a bill that would have fixed the border crisis. Now, would that bill have solved the border crisis? I guess it was the one that the Oklahoma senator and whomever was in the Senate. That was a Senate bill. Would that have solved the crisis?
Yeah, that was Senator Langford's bill, and no, it would not have solved the crisis. H.R. 2, which this body passed, would have been much more effective in that regard. What the Senate so-called bipartisan bill, first of all, was drafted by the Biden-Harris DHS, basically, and it was a joint effort of a Democrat, a Republican, and an independent, and I have every reason to believe they were actually trying to craft something constructive, but neither they nor their staff have the depth of knowledge on immigration, and so they ended up getting basically
So it would not have
Would not
solved
have,
the
no,
problem.
it would not have
Yeah.
solved the border. It would have codified some of
Right.
the illegal actions they've taken.
Exactly. Commissioner Carr, you've openly criticized the Biden administration's very expensive $42 million BEAD program. Who's primarily to blame for this program's lack of meaningful follow-through, and what are the causes of these, where we spent all this money for broadband access, and I know my district desperately needs that, but no one's getting broadband. No one's benefiting from this. What's going on with that? What's this administration done with that?
Yeah, I think
42 billion.
the reason why we're having $42 billion allocated, 1,039 days in, not a single person connected, is because the administration under Vice President Harris's leadership has prioritized a progressive wish list of issues. They want to put DEI requirements in place. They want to put price controls in place. They want government-run networks. So it has taken time to put those requirements in place, and that has delayed the actual turning of dirt.
That's so bad. It's such a huge issue in Kentucky. And Congress allocated $42 billion, yet no one has benefited from this. That's what the purpose of this committee is about: waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement of the federal government. If someone on the other side wants to defend this BEAD program, I'm anxious when they get their 5 minutes. Ms. Mobbs, I believe the Chinese Communist Party is the biggest threat we have to the United States. Do you believe the Biden-Harris administration is still approaching the Chinese Communist Party as a competitor instead of an adversary? And how has their approach contributed to the CCP's increased infiltration and influence operations, such as flying a spy balloon over our country, buying up land close to U.S. military bases, and increased aggression towards Taiwan?
So I do feel that we are approaching it as competition versus looking at them as an adversary, which I said in my opening statement is critical for us to develop policies to effectively begin to deter and counter them as an adversary. Unfortunately, we've had weak deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. naval fleet in the Pacific is crucial for countering China's growing military presence. We have the lowest number of ships since the Cold War, and that rapid naval expansion poses a significant threat. And the Biden administration has unfortunately been slow to increase military investments in that region. We've also failed to mitigate Chinese economic dominance via maintaining tariffs or failing to do so from economic sanctions. We've had an inadequate response to cyber threats, and we've missed opportunities for strategic diplomacy that could help us establish a winning strategy with our counterparts. So in essence, we are failing to win in this strategy. We are looking at managing the competition versus dominating.
All right, very good. We talked about the border crisis. We've talked about misappropriating $42 billion in taxpayer dollars. We published a report last week where $200 billion was lost to fraud during COVID in the unemployment insurance program. We talked about the lack of seriousness and the soft on China policies of this administration. Lastly, I want to ask about the Green New Deal, because when Vice President Harris was campaigning for president, she was an advocate of the Green New Deal. Ms. Gunasakura, what would happen? What would our energy grid look like? What would America look like if Vice President Harris was able to implement the Green New Deal?
Well, we have a snapshot of what that would look like because under the leadership of President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, the agencies have been largely implementing pieces of the Green New Deal. And so the resulting effect is increased cost energy and a less reliable grid, and also no real tangible benefit to show in terms of reducing overall emissions. So it's quite counterintuitive to the purported and stated goals of the Green New Deal to improve the environment. What you've actually seen is that you've had electricity prices go up. Most recently, home heating oil is up 36%, electricity is up 32%, and natural gas is up 25%. This is all a direct result of policies coming from agencies run by the Biden-Harris officials, agencies enacting regulations that put the squeeze on these operations, inject politics, and manifest itself in increased prices on the American people, expanding financial burdens.
So, and I'm going to give the ranking member an extra minute and a half. So is it safe to say the Kamala Harris Green New Deal would contribute as much to increased inflation as the Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act has?
Well, yeah, certainly, and I know you recall, she was the tie-breaking vote that passed the Inflation Reduction Act. But yeah, the Green New Deal, when energy prices go up, the price of everything else goes up, and when you're in the inflationary economy, everyone's dealing with it, makes it that much worse.
Thank you. I now yield 6.5 to the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, thank you kindly. For the record, it is Kamala Harris, not Kamala. So, I mean, we take it as an honest mistake, but I think everybody on the committee is capable of saying our.
You know, I have trouble with a lot of last names.
I gotcha.
That's a characteristic from Appalachia. I apologize.
Well, I remember when I hiked the Appalachia Trail, they said, if you call it Appalachia, they'll throw an Appalachia. So, all right, back to you, Ms. Gunasekera. And I just want to get this straight. Nobody here has disavowed their own connection to Project 2025 in the big report that I'm calling the MAGA Manifesto, but the big book. Donald Trump is trying to backpedal right now. What he said when he was at the Heritage Foundation is our country's going to hell. The critical job of institutions such as Heritage's, and admittedly he called Heritage Heritage's, but we know he meant Heritage, to lay the groundwork. And Heritage does such an incredible job at that, he said. They're going to lay the groundwork and detailed plans for exactly what our movement will do and what your movement will do when the American people give us a colossal mandate to save America. Are you not proud of your association with Donald Trump and the fact that he seems to be embracing Project 2025?
It was an honor of my life to serve President Trump at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And the work that I've put into Project 2025 is a result of that experience and lessons learned that I think would be extremely beneficial to trying to advance the cause of the conservative movement, to reduce the government, ensure that the voice of the people.
Just to interrupt for a
is held in
second.
that.
So your contribution to the Project 2025 report is something you're proud of, right?
Yes, yes.
And you're proud of the association with Donald Trump.
Again, I disagree with the way that you're asking that question.
Well,
I understand
okay.
what you're trying to do here. You're trying to create
I'm just trying to get to the
a
facts,
connection.
that's all, because everybody seems to be backpedaling from what seems completely obvious. Donald Trump praised Project 2025. He said that this lays the groundwork and details the plans for what our movement will do. And now all of a sudden, everybody wants to run away from that. Well, Mr. Krikorian, let me come to you. I was interested in your little exchange about the Senate immigration deal. We had a bipartisan border agreement, which Donald Trump blew up at the last minute because he didn't want a border solution. He wanted a border crisis to run on. But in any event, are you denying that the people at the border who work at the border wanted that deal, wanted the immigration deal?
The now former chairman of or head of the Border Patrol Union endorsed it. And it seemed to be, my sense was that I haven't talked to him about it, but that it was because it offered extra, pay.
Well, I'll help you out. As conservatives balk, U.S. Border Patrol Union endorses Senate immigration deal. Yep. That is, the union for everybody who works at the border wanted it. There are people who want to politicize the border and don't want a solution there because they would prefer to engage in scapegoating and immigrant bashing and stereotyping and so on. But we had what conservative senators were describing as a great deal, and yet that was destroyed, and that's unfortunate, but it demonstrates the real lack of commitment to make something happen there. Ms. Mobbs, I wanted to come to you. I was very interested in your remarks about Ukraine. From what you were saying, it indicated to me that unlike Donald Trump and unlike J.D. Vance, you actually support Ukraine's effort to repel Vladimir Putin's filthy imperialist invasion of their country. Is that right? Do you support Ukraine against Putin?
I do support Ukraine against Putin.
Okay, so you would disavow the positions taken by Trump and J.D. Vance, who say they don't care. J.D. Vance said he doesn't care, he doesn't give a damn about the people of Ukraine.
I can't speak to their position outside of what I witnessed in the first debate when President Trump specifically stated that he did not and would not concede any territory to Vladimir Putin.
He did say that?
He did in his first debate.
But, okay, I thought his position was he's going to solve this on day one, basically by letting Putin have what he wants. But I'm glad to hear it if that's if that's his position. It's certainly not the position being taken by MAGA Republicans, as you know, who have opposed and consistently voted against aid to the Ukrainian people. So that's different. All right, let me come to you, Mr. Carr, because I know you're on the FCC right now. You did not disclaim the possibility of becoming chairman of the FCC, and that's cool. Everybody's got ambitions, and you've not disclaimed your connection to Project 2025 or to Donald Trump. But here's what I want to ask you about. Donald Trump said after his, I think everybody can concede, world-class, dreadful, terrible, and pathetic performance in the presidential debate, he wanted to blame ABC for it, and he called on the FCC to take away ABC's license. Okay, in January he called for revocation of NBC's license because he felt that they cut short his full victory speech after he won the heavily contested Iowa caucus. Okay, if you were chair of the FCC and Donald Trump, per usual, called you from the Oval Office or called upon the FCC to demand the revocation of a license for ABC or NBC because he had a political problem with something they had done, what would your reaction be? It's an honest question. How would you deal with that?
Thank you for the question. I don't know about all of the premises in there, but I'll tell you.
Well, they're all true, but I can give you the documentation if you want.
Speaking of the hypothetical about the future that you were laying out, I'm not sort of speaking to a hypothetical future, but I can tell you where I am right now, which is, look, I've been nominated by President Trump. I've been nominated by President Biden. I've been vetted by the Senate 3 times. I've been confirmed unanimously. In all those contexts, I've been asked repeatedly very similar versions of this question. I've said, going all the way back to 2017, every single decision that I make on the FCC will be based on the FCC's precedent, federal law, and the First Amendment. I've said it repeatedly, and I've acted consistent with that.
Okay, and so just to be a little more specific, you would agree that the president has no authority to order a federal commission or agency to engage in an action of a political or partisan nature?
Again, what I said is anything that comes from the White House, whether it's Republican or Democrat, every action that I will take at the FCC is the same that I've done over the last 6 years, which is apply the law consistent with the First Amendment.
All right, so are you disavowing the so-called unitary executive theory that's being propounded by Project 2025, that everything that happens in the executive branch of government, including commission and agency action, is directly under the political control of the President of the United States?
And the gentleman's time expired by a lot, but if you want to answer it, you can. If you don't, you don't have to.
Could you answer the?
We can answer it.
This is not an issue that I have spoken to publicly. It's not something that I've addressed.
That's why I'm asking you now. Do you disavow?
I was gracious with the time. You have went a minute over, 7.5 minutes. Chair now recognizes Mr. Groffman from Wisconsin.
Sure. First of all, I just give you a historical quote to start things off. They asked Benjamin Franklin on the Constitution, and he said he was giving the American people a republic if they can keep it. So every 4 years we got to fight to keep that republic. Now, Mr. Carr, you kind of were interesting there, in which you implied that the Biden administration is intentionally not enforcing spent a long time not enforcing our border law, and therefore apparently intentionally trying to get as many people here as possible, which would be one way to change the country that we have permanently. Another way would be try to get rid of the middle class. And one of you, was it Ms. Mobbs or Mrs. I'm not going to, Sakara, who mentioned the electric vehicle thing? That you? I think a car is something that Americans really need today to get around, I guess, unless you're in New York City or something. Question I have for you, this electric car thing, do you have any idea how much it's going to increase the cost of a car?
Well, we have a snapshot because the price of vehicles has already increased substantially to the point where a lot of Americans are priced out of purchasing new cars. It ranges from $10,000 to $30,000 depending on the chassis and what manufacturer you're ultimately looking at. But The reality is when Americans are priced out of buying new cars, they drive older cars longer, so all of the benefits you would try to achieve by improving efficiency standards are not realized because the changeover isn't actually achieved.
Okay. As I understand it, the cost of insurance is also dramatically higher for an electric car, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of questions, too, with regard to replacing whether or not an electric vehicle is totaled once it is involved in a fender bender. That typically is a quick fix for a regular gas-powered vehicle. And then when the battery, the life of the battery, again, this ranges everywhere from 3 years to 10 years, what actually happens with the end of life, the recycling piece of that, and that all adds to considerations on insurance. And what we've seen recently is the trend as the price continues to go up.
Right. I also heard yesterday for the first time, I wasn't aware of this, these electric cars that people are going to have to buy, they depreciate quicker than standard cars. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, I've heard that as well. Again, I would just look at consumer preference. It's not necessarily about picking one technology over the other. It's what do the consumers want. And when it comes to mobility, they want an affordable, reliable car that safely gets them and their family from point A to point B. And increasingly, Americans are saying no to electric vehicles that this administration is pushing alongside state-based regulations like California that's looking to ban the sale of gas-powered vehicles starting in 5 to 7 years from now.
It's a difficult thing to wonder, but given that people need a car, the combination of driving up the cost of a new car, driving down the amount you're getting in a trade-on, and the dramatic increase you're going to have to pay in insurance, it's going to make it much more difficult to be members of the middle class in America than before these cars, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, point A to point B is usually taking your kids to school or driving to your job and coming back, going to the grocery store and coming back, aspects that are fundamental to create a thriving and healthy home. And you have to think, too, what is all of this for? Why is this administration and the Biden-Harris administration so keen on pushing Americans into electric vehicles? They say it's to reduce emissions and for their climate agenda, but the reality is the majority of the minerals that go into these batteries are sourced from areas like China, where they not only have they have appalling environmental standards, they violate basic norms of humanitarian standards and rely on either forced or child labor to extract these minerals. So if you think big picture, it actually undermines some fundamental goals that all Americans, Republican or Democrats, have fought very hard to seek some degree of improvement.
Yeah. Another way that you try to get rid of the middle class is you cause inflation by spending huge amounts of money that we don't have. And I want to give you an example of that. We talk about the huge cost of inflation from the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, but it's forgotten that the Democrat Party, if it weren't for Senator Manchin, actually wanted to have this bill be 3 times the cost of the bill that was eventually passed. What effect would have that had on inflation if the vast majority of Democrats got what they wanted, including apparently President Biden? What effect would have that had on inflation? Would have been much worse than we already saw.
Gentleman's time's expired, but please feel free to answer that.
Yeah, I would just summarize it. I think everyone has done a good job on this side of the dais, but it would make Americans' lives that much harder because of the financial hardships and burdens that have been experienced during the Biden-Harris administration. Their disregard for inflation that was predicted, especially with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and how that has manifested itself in more expensive gas, groceries, and everyday goods.
Just one other brief comment.
Okay.
A comment was made about the Republicans trying to ban books. Usually I think that when Republicans try to ban books, it's explicit books for sex ed class for elementary school kids. I don't think a lot of people realize that when Democrats talk about that, that's what they mean.
All right, Chair, I recognize Ms. Norton from Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Perriman, this question is for you. The Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, landmark Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law provided historic investments in our communities and America's future. Under the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Biden-Harris administration has announced $480 billion for over 60,000 projects to date, including upgrading bridges in Kentucky, replacing lead pipes in Detroit, and new and ungraded rail tracks from North Carolina to Virginia. On September 5th, 2024, President Biden and the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced a $7.3 billion investment for clean energy in rural communities, including in Kentucky, Ohio, Texas, and Florida, made possible by the Inflation Reduction Act. So, Ms. Perriman, how has the Biden-Harris administration's focus on investing in America through landmark legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law helped communities across the country?
Well, I think they're tremendous achievements, and we've seen investment, job growth, hundreds of thousands of jobs that have been reported. By the way, at the same time that we are seeing a multi-year low in inflation, which many economists did not think was particularly possible, to be able to keep unemployment and to build jobs at the same time, keep unemployment relatively low, build jobs, create new jobs at the same time, while also reducing inflation to multi-year lows. So those are some policy highlights. But other things that are worth highlighting is the work that the Infrastructure Act has done to connect communities that have been traditionally left out of these infrastructure bills, where infrastructure has been built and has actually torn communities apart, and highways that have run through communities and displaced people. And the IRA did a lot of work, or the Infrastructure Act did a lot of work in order to invest specifically in those communities that had been left out. And so those are some of the highlights. The other thing is with respect to health care. The Inflation Reduction Act, of course, has made tremendous strides towards making our medications more affordable by allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices, which is something, of course, Project 2025 calls on repealing for all Americans, including the middle class.
Would you call these investment policies failures or successes?
You know, I think that it's not just me that would call them a success, but I think Nobel laureate economists have called them successes, as have communities across America, including in home states like my state of Texas, that are seeing a lot of investment in their communities.
Well, investments like these and others through the Inflation Reduction Act have led to the creation of more than 330,000 good-paying and union clean energy jobs since the law was enacted a little over 2 years ago. In total, the Biden-Harris administration's leadership has led to more than 775,000 new manufacturing jobs, while 200,000 manufacturing jobs were lost under the Trump administration. Ms. Perriman, do policies that create good-paying union jobs benefit Americans?
They certainly do, and that's one of the concerns that we have with a number of these far-right policies that you see in Project 2025 that are really seeking to repeal that progress.
Would you say this is a failure or a success?
Creating jobs in the United States, particularly good jobs, is always a success.
Another highlight of the bipartisan infrastructure law is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And do not just take my word for it. We know Republican governors think so too. I have a packet of press releases and statements from 12 Republican governors, including the governors of Alaska, Arkansas, Idaho, Indiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Vermont, Virginia, and West Virginia, celebrating the money they will receive through this program to connect rural communities in their states to high-speed internet. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit these 12-piece releases and statements into the record.
Without objection, to ordered.
Thank you. I am grateful for the Biden-Harris administration's leadership investing in American communities and American workers. I'm also proud to have passed the infrastructure reduction and bipartisan infrastructure law that have made these investments possible. And I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Sessions from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to go to Megan Mobbs, if I can, please, first. Maybe the only one, but the time we have. We have heard a lot of discussion about families, women, safety, people being able to afford housing, people being able to afford a job that they may have to drive to, people, middle America, families, women, children, education. Can you please talk to us what I believe is about the administration's excessive spending that has caused inflation, a border that is open where we do not have enough housing for people, cities and crime impacting our schools and communities, and lastly, the attack on women that has occurred by allowing transgenders to compete against women, thus taking away their opportunity to find success at even national championships. Can you give us an overlay of that? We know that you are here today to talk about Center for American Safety, Security, and Independence. I think they are taking this away from middle-class America.
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate the question. And specifically, I'm here to talk about kind of foreign policy and national security failures. And what I can say about that is that when we fail to demonstrate safety and security both at home and abroad, the most vulnerable are always impacted. And the most vulnerable are typically the elderly, women, and children. And we are seeing an inability of women to feel safe in their communities. There is the perception that crime is on the rise. There is the perception that schools are unsafe. And certainly when we perceive our lives to be unsafe, you act in accordance with that. There's a reason why one of the largest growing gun ownership is actually Black women because of feelings of safety. So certainly there is an eradication of feelings of safety, security here in America. I think it's important to also recognize that what I said in my opening statement, that it's not just here at home that women and girls are being impacted. It is women and girls abroad who are being impacted by these failed foreign policies, and they are often placed in these vulnerable positions as well because we are not demonstrating substantial leadership.
Thank you very much. Mr. CARR, I live within that area that is not fully compatible with broadband, and have several counties that are completely without the ability to have broadband, and yet I'm understanding $42 billion has been spent by the administration, and it's not out there. It's not happening, and the Democrats love to talk about all this money that they spend, but I think it's a lot like President Obama, where he had back in 2009 all this $787 billion that had to be spent within 6 weeks, and you can't even engineer a project in that time. Why is it that this $42 billion has not taken hold of giving people what they needed now to compete?
I think we've now gone to the opposite extreme. If you look at Texas alone, they're supposed to get $3.3 billion of the $42 billion to connect somewhere in the order of 628,000 homes and businesses that have nothing today, so millions of Texas. And what's happened is, rather than focusing on quickly turning dirt or otherwise connecting Americans, they have spent time and wasted time adopting these DEI preferences, these climate change agendas, price controls. You know, we heard about some governors that supported this. Yes, everybody was excited about this. Once it was passed, the money was going to be spent. Every state wanted to benefit. They deserve to benefit. But Virginia, for instance, they were the first out of the gate, put their first application in. You know what happened? They had to wait and sit around while the Biden administration, under Vice President Harris's leadership, tried to force them to put in price controls that the state didn't want to do. So the good news is all this money has not been spent. It's largely still sitting there. There's time to correct course. Let's get rid of the extraneous political goals and just connect Americans.
It seems like to me that this is something that Republicans have gathered, and that's almost why the Supreme Court said as it relates to the issue of abortion, we will let local people make their own decisions. We will provide the money, provide basic parameters around it, and let the states go and get things done. I think it's a model that's going to gain power this next year. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize Mr. Lynch from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clear up one part of the record. This committee was actually had jurisdiction over the negotiations that the Trump administration conducted for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. They negotiated directly, unilaterally with the Taliban. And from the very beginning, the status of Afghan women and girls was not a priority for the administration until this committee, and I was the chairman, called Zalmay Khalilzad, the special ambassador for the Trump administration, came to this committee, and in a bipartisan fashion, I believe Mr. Sessions was the member of the committee at the time, we insisted that 4 women would be appointed to represent the voices of Afghan women and girls. And after that, we received a letter that I'm going to ask to have submitted to the record. They thanked the members of this committee on both sides for having, here it is, to having women appointed to that negotiation. But the idea, and look, that was from the very beginning, and the Trump administration said the status of women and girls in Afghanistan would not be a priority for our negotiating team. Let me leave it at that. So we are on the heels of a 2-year sham impeachment that failed to yield any evidence of wrongdoing by President Biden whatsoever. And now Republican leadership has turned their focus to Vice President Harris and the border. But I do want to review the facts. Earlier this year, a group of Republican and Democratic senators announced that they had worked out with the Biden-Harris administration a deal to negotiate and develop a bipartisan national security agreement. Importantly, this agreement proposed the most comprehensive border security reforms in nearly 30 years, including $20 billion to add more than 5,000 Customs and Border Protection personnel at the border. It also included critical provisions, including cutting-edge detection technology to combat fentanyl distribution and human trafficking, and it codified the power of any president to shut down the border in an emergency. President Biden stated he would sign the legislation upon passage. Vice President Harris urged Congress to set political gamesmanship aside and urgently pass the agreement to secure the border. No one agreed that the bill was perfect, but everyone agreed it would greatly improve the situation. Unfortunately, former President Trump felt differently. As reported by various Republican members of Congress, he sought to kill the bipartisan border deal to keep the issue alive purely for his own political gain. According to Republican Senator Mitt Romney, former governor of my state, and if anything, an honest man, he said, and I quote, "Former President Trump indicated to senators that he does not want us to solve the problem at the border. He wants to lay the blame for the border at Biden's feet, and the idea that someone running for president would say, quote, please hurt the country so I can blame my opponent and help my politics is a shocking development," close quote. The former president's opposition to the deal even led Republican Senator Tom Tillis to warn his Republican colleagues, "It is immoral," and this is another quote, "It is immoral for me to think you look the other way because you think this is the linchpin for President Trump's efforts to win the White House." Unsurprisingly, however, this Republican-led House did look the other way, with Speaker Johnson killing the bipartisan deal before the text was even available to the House. Ms. Perriman, Vice President Harris has committed to signing the bipartisan border security agreement into law if she's elected, even while acknowledging that it is not a perfect deal. How does Trump's ability to shut down the democratic process and the Republicans' inability or unwillingness to stand up for their constituents affect the representative nature of our democracy?
This is one of the most unfortunate trends that we have. I mean, the bipartisan border deal was something that if you got a bunch of people together, they would agree on some parts of it, disagree on other parts of it, because it was the product of compromise, which has always been a hallmark of legislation in this country, because that's what we are. We're a country of compromise, and we're a country that gets things done. Our Congress has not been able to do that, unfortunately. And as a result of not being able to pass this legislation, we know that there is harm and that the crisis is not being addressed. So I think it's a deeply troubling outgrowth of broader polarization that we see, and this is exactly why I think so many of the presidential libraries are saying we have to have some type of role in American politics to restore compromise and understanding how to work across the aisle in disagreements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds.
Thank you, Chairman. Actually, I'm glad we're coming in at this time because we need to set the record straight about the Senate bill and actually H.R. 2. When the Senate bill was actually published, I remember I was at a dinner Sunday night when it came out, when the text came out. I read the text of the Senate bill. Many members in the House read the text of the Senate bill. Members contacted Speaker Johnson, and we were very clear. There is no way the Senate bill should get a vote in the House, because it is a terrible piece of legislation that will not secure the southern border. House Republicans have passed border security measures, H.R. 2. We did it more than a year ago. Has Chuck Schumer brought it up for even debate or a vote in the Senate? No, he has not. Has the White House decided to reach out to the Speaker Johnson to debate and deliberate or negotiate or compromise on H.R. 2 and its elements to secure the southern border? No, they have not. They're in charge. In the Senate and in the White House, they've done nothing except a bill that couldn't even make it out of the Senate. So I think it's important to set the record straight. Oh, also, by the way, House Republicans weren't going to vote for that bill, and that was before Donald Trump even made his view known on the Senate compromise bill. We were already against it when the bill text came out because it's a trash bill. Now, moving on. Ms. Genesekera, I think I got it right. Can you explain to me what an environmental impact assessment is?
Yeah, certainly. It's an assessment a federal agency does to measure a proposed project's potential impact on the environment.
Does the Biden-Harris administration, does their EPA use environmental impact assessments?
They do in some applications. Typically, it's in the context of of NEPA, which is in conjunction with other federal agencies. But yes.
If you're trying to go through the process of, let's say, limiting permit applications for leases that have been extended to private drillers, would an environmental impact assessment be the way that you would do that?
It certainly is a tool that this administration has used. It's to analyze it to death or to keep it in bureaucratic purgatory, which with a lot of important infrastructure projects, we've actually seen. This administration has backtracked on important infrastructure improvements that we put in place to limit time for review, to limit the scope of review that this administration, again, has changed to the detriment of building out energy infrastructure projects, highway infrastructure projects, and on and on.
Would you argue that this administration is pretty adept at using these types of reviews to slow walk energy development projects in the United States?
The Biden-Harris administration is an expert at using the federal government and weaponizing those processes to undermine the development of key energy projects that we need.
Thank you so much. Ms. Mobbs, I have a question for you. You said in your opening testimony that there have been embassies that have been lost/evacuated. How many embassies have been evacuated under the Biden-Harris administration?
There's been 7 total evacuations, and then there's been numerous partial evacuations.
What's a partial evacuation of a U.S. embassy?
It's when non-essential personnel are removed for safety purposes and then can return later.
What are the foreign policy, I would say, what's the foreign policy, what's going on in foreign policy in a specific country that would require the United States to do a partial evacuation of an embassy?
So the situation would have deteriorated so critically that they felt that they could not establish protection for those non-essential personnel for them to be kind of forced to leave.
In any administration, let's say the last 30 years, how many embassies have been lost over the last 30 years, evacuated either total or partial?
I don't have the number in front of me. I could get it to you. I think the important thing here, though, is that because there's a historic number, it's because of the unprecedented levels of chaos and instability and the inability of our State Department and certainly the executive to project enough strength and power to protect our embassies and our embassy officials around the world.
Would you say that this State Department has done a fair job, an average job, a terrible job of getting Americans out of harm's way in countries that are experiencing serious security questions for the United States citizens?
I think we've seen substantial and significant problems in a number of different theaters where the State Department has failed to effectively plan to ensure that American citizens are safely returned to their home.
Do you think that in Afghanistan it was wise for us to pull our troops out last and for the State Department to not do everything possible to get Americans out before it was turned over to the Taliban?
I deeply believe we should never leave an American behind. I was a huge advocate of withdrawing from Afghanistan. We were spending $2 trillion there, almost $300 million of U.S. taxpayer dollars there every day. But what we saw was basically a catastrophic failure of the State Department, of the DOD, of our intelligence agencies, of the National Security Council, of the National Security Advisor to effectively coordinate an effective strategy to allow our interests to remain and to get American citizens safely out.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Conley from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Perriman, I'm trying to cover a lot of territory, so let's be quick. The gentlelady next to you decried the fact that Biden administration is impeding energy production in the United States. Do you happen to know what the daily oil and gas production is in the United States right now?
I don't have the precise figure, but I know it hasn't been impeded.
13.4 million barrels. Is that the largest in the world right now?
I believe so.
Is it also the largest in American history?
I believe it is.
And are we now exporting energy because we have so much of it?
We are.
Are we, in fact, energy dependent, independent?
I believe we're close.
Thank you very much. So much for the failure of the Biden administration. Infrastructure. Also, comments about infrastructure. Did the Trump administration have numerous infrastructure weeks? We're going to promote infrastructure 6, 12 times.
They did.
They did. Did they ever pass an infrastructure bill?
They did not.
Did President Biden pass an infrastructure bill?
He did.
Is it also the largest infrastructure bill in American history?
The Biden-Harris infrastructure bill is the largest in American history.
And pretty comprehensive. It covers lots of different kinds of infrastructure. Is that correct?
Many infrastructure and lots of investment.
Right. Now, Ms. Moby has an interesting revisionist history with respect to foreign policy, which happens to be my beat. So let's visit foreign policy. Decrying Afghanistan. So I gotta go back in history because I remember my other committee having Ambassador Khalilzad, who was the negotiator for President Trump on Afghanistan. Is it true that the United States, under the Trump administration, had direct negotiations with the Taliban in Doha and excluded the Afghan government from that table and those negotiations, the very government purportedly we were there to support?
That is true.
Did that agreement that Ambassador Khalilzad, on behalf of President Trump, negotiate with the Taliban, did that also involve the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners, many of whom were in prison because they were suspected terrorists?
Yes.
5,000, have I got that right?
Those are the figures I'm familiar with.
And did that agreement also actually stipulate a full and complete withdrawal of U.S. troops by May of 2021?
I recall that it did.
Right. And did President Biden inherit all of that?
And more.
And did he try to extend the withdrawal to buy time to avoid the very chaos, unfortunately, we experienced?
That is what I understand.
And do you think it would be fair to say that actually if we're decrying what happened that summer, we might want to look at the antecedents and the discouragement and the demoralization of the Afghan government and military from resisting the Taliban, given the fact that the sponsor of the Afghan government, purportedly the United States, had clearly abandoned that government? Would that be a fair statement, do you think?
I believe so.
Okay. She also talked about Ukraine, that somehow we should have, anticipated what was going to happen. Was there a president of the United States who withheld Javelin missiles necessary for the defense of Ukraine and threatened to withhold all military assistance to Ukraine until and unless the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, provided political dirt on a political opponent?
I believe there was, and it was the former.
And was that president, in fact, impeached for that very phone conversation over that very issue?
Yes.
And would it be fair to say that that development, that threat, and that withholding of weapons might be construed, if you were Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin, as a sign of weakness on the part of Ukraine and a sign that maybe the United States wasn't going to be there should something bad happen between Russia and Ukraine?
Seems like a plausible.
And might that be enhanced by the fact that that same president, President Trump, actually praised President Putin on numerous occasions and even said that he trusted his word over U.S. intelligence with respect to Russian interference in the 2016 election?
That is unfortunately what the former president.
And finally, Iran and nuclear weapons. Was there not an agreement that the United States actually led that involved Russia and China, Europe and Iran,
There was
to limit nuclear weapon production in Iran?
There was a historic agreement.
And was it working?
Yes,
In all respects?
I believe so.
Inspected by IAEA and the Trump administration and certified by both.
Yes.
Is that correct? Uh-huh. And what happened to that treaty?
President Trump pulled out.
And has Iran been less active in producing nuclear weapons or more?
Iran is now a greater threat because of that failure of diplomacy.
So much for efficacy. Just thought I'd revisit that revisionist history of foreign policy. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Dr. Fox from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Krikorian, according to the Office of Management and Budget, each year the taxpayers provide more than $1.2 trillion or nearly 5% of GDP in funding for thousands of programs across the entire government through grants and other forms of financial assistance. For such a large sum, taxpayers need assurance that their money is not being wasted or spent undermining law and order. However, taxpayers have no such assurances today. Should American taxpayer funds be given to organizations and NGOs that undermine U.S. immigration laws and help illegal aliens get into our country?
No, Congresswoman, they should not. And in fact, you're seeing that every day, even outside the United States, where NGOs funded by American taxpayers are facilitating the move of illegal immigrants to our borders.
A second question, please. Last year, the DHS Inspector General published a report on the Biden-Harris administration's failure to provide adequate oversight of federal grant funding. That is why I introduced H.R. 8334, the Grant Integrity and Border Security Act, to require any entity seeking a federal grant to certify that they have not and will not violate federal immigration law with regard to assisting or attempting to bring aliens into the United States illegally. This committee voted to pass H.R. 8334 in May to help correct yet another of the Biden-Harris administration's failures. Can you provide us with other examples of where the Biden-Harris administration refuses to enforce existing U.S. immigration law as Congress intended?
Well, the big example is the refusal to detain people who are under law required to be detained. If an inadmissible alien either crosses the border illegally or shows up at a port of entry and says that he is making some kind of protection claim, he fears being returned to his home country, the INA requires that person to be detained. And the release, the mass release from detention of people who have no right to be in the United States is the single biggest driver of subsequent illegal immigration. In other words, someone who is thinking about immigrating to the United States and paying a smuggler a lot of money to do so is only going to do that if the odds of his succeeding, which is to say being let go into the United States, is high enough. And the mass release policies of this administration have, in fact, incentivized this entire border crisis that we've been facing.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gunasakura, as I have said before, the Biden-Harris era EPA has managed to add $1.3 trillion in costs on Americans. In contrast, in 8 years, the Obama EPA added only about $300 billion in costs. What will be the impact of these new costs on consumers?
Well, it makes the price of everything go up. Regulatory costs are another form of tax that's ultimately borne out by the consumers that are either using the energy that the Environmental Protection Agency is trying to squeeze out of existence or create barriers in the cultivation of commercial activities. And so at the end of the day, it means Americans are paying more for gas at the pump, electricity bills, whatever form they may receive that in, or more for groceries at the grocery store.
I have a second question for you. Since the start of the Biden-Harris administration, Americans have seen the cost of everything rise by over 20%, as you alluded to, which means families pay $11,000 more each year to maintain the same lifestyle. What role have the Biden-Harris administration's energy and climate policies contribute to the economic pain felt by Americans?
A huge role. This was a day one action of this administration, promises made during the campaign by President Biden, and then longstanding actions in the Senate by Vice President Kamala Harris, consistent with actions she took on day one to effectuate a war on fossil fuels, as they say. This is traditional energy, coal, oil, and natural gas. The reality is this energy still provides 80% of our daily energy needs. So if you have an administration using the power of their agencies to squeeze the development and cultivation of those energy resources that really are the lifeblood of our entire economy, it makes the price of everything go up, and that is exactly what we've seen throughout this administration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair, and I recognize Mr. Khanna from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gunasakura, you're the former EPA Chief of Staff in the Trump administration, and my understanding is you authored the Project 2025 chapter on the EPA. Do you still support Project 2025's proposal to reinstate Schedule F, which would lead to the firing of 50,000 expert civil servants?
Absolutely, and I think there's more quote-unquote civil servants that should be gone because the growth of the federal bureaucracy actually gets in the way of agencies fulfilling important missions like protecting public health and the environment.
And do you have an interest in serving in a future Trump administration should he win?
I do not.
Do you believe that the president should, if Trump wins, that he should implement the Project 2025 recommendation of firing these civil servants?
I think it's the president's prerogative to determine what policies he ultimately wants to implement.
What would your recommendation be?
There's a lot of recommendations that I would suggest that the president embrace from an overarching governance perspective.
Would that include the firing of the 50,000 civil servants, the Schedule F?
Yeah, I actually have a book coming out called Y'all Fired, A Southern Belle's Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp, and I go step by step of what I would suggest the president do to actually right-size the federal government.
Is it fair to say that there are other people who share your view who will be in his administration?
There's a lot of people in the conservative movement that share this view, and there's a lot of Americans.
And will some of them be in the administration? I mean, I have no problem in terms of the transparency. I just think the American people should know what their choice is. And my understanding is that your view is that we should fire these civil servants for whatever reasons. I haven't read your book. Maybe I will. And there are other people in the conservative movement who want to do that. And if Trump wins, you believe they should help implement that, correct?
I don't know who the president plans to hire for various positions. I know when he's ready to announce that, he will.
But certainly it's reasonable to assume some of these people would be in the administration pushing this view of bureaucratic reform, as you put it.
Yeah, bureaucratic reform is very.
And that includes firing these 50,000 civil servants?
Again, I would suggest more than 50,000, but there's a lot
Okay.
within the conservative movement that believe, and a lot of the American electorate that actually believe the growth of the federal bureaucracy.
I appreciate your perspective. I just want to make sure that people, because Donald Trump is saying, oh, I don't know anything about Project 2025. You should just say, yes, we're going to fire 50,000 civil servants like you've been honest about. I respect that, so that the American people can see if that's what they really
Yeah,
want.
Mr. Khanna,
Carr, let me just go to Mr. Carr.
I would just say Schedule F, the policy existed well before the most recent iteration
I
of the
appreciate
mandate
that.
for leadership.
Mr. Carr, you didn't answer Mr. Raskin's simple question on ABC and revoking the license. I don't need to know whether you make the same decisions with Democrats or Republicans. I just want to know simply, do you think, based on the ABC debate, in your role as a former FCC commissioner, and do you think that that is grounds for revoking the license for ABC?
Thank you. What I've said is consistent with what I've said for the past 6 years, which is every single decision, including in the licensing context, is one that I'll make based on the facts, the record.
So what is
always
your,
consistent with the First Amendment.
the whole country has the facts. We all saw the debate. I mean, it's not like some complicated question. Based on those facts, based on what David Muir did, based on the questions that were asked, would you recommend that the license be revoked? I mean, President Trump obviously has an opinion on it. He's made it. What's your opinion?
Look, I think I've been pretty clear. Again, I've been nominated by both President Biden and
That's not
nominated by
answering
President
the
Trump,
question.
and
That's
vetted
not answering
3
the question.
times.
I mean,
I've been asked different versions.
You know,
of
I'm
this
not trying to be a
question.
debate moderator, but it's a simple. That answer would never fly in a debate. I mean, come on. It's a simple question. Do you agree with President Trump's opinion that? Look, at least I respect that Trump has an opinion. Just give us your opinion, yes or no.
My opinion is that the FCC in every single case has to apply the law consistent with the First Amendment.
And I'm saying, how would you apply it here? If Trump looked at the debate, he said the debate was unfair. He says that one thing that people respect about him, he says what he believes. You're sitting here and not giving us an opinion. Just say, yes, I agree with President Trump, or no, I disagree with it. This is what people, they hate the obfuscation. Just take a stand. How hard is it?
My position is clear. What you're raising are concerns about weaponization. I think that's important that we talk about that. When there's a license transfer of radio stations.
This is a bunch of gobbledygook.
Let the witness answer the question, please.
I'll give you an actual case. A license transfer in South Florida to a group that people believed were conservative purchasers. Democrats said the FCC should block it because the election depended on it.
But my question is very simple. Based on the debate, and
We've
based
had
on what
Democrats in Congress
do you
who wrote
think
letters to cable companies telling them they should drop
you're not
Fox
answering the
News
question. Then
because
let me
of the
try one last
decisions
time.
that the newsroom made.
Based on the debate, did you think that the questions were unfair or rigged in a way that calls for ABC's license to be revoked? The way President Trump has been very clear. I respect, he's very clear on his view. Do you agree or disagree with his view? It's a yes or no.
Gosh, I think my position has been very clear going back to 2017 as a commissioner.
Gentleman's time's expired, but please feel free to answer the question.
2012,
Mr.
I've
Carter.
maintained a very consistent issue. But if your concern is weaponization, we should talk about that. When President Biden stood at the White House podium and said Elon Musk is worth being looked at, and then all of a sudden, the FCC abruptly reverses a 2020 decision to get him $885 million to bring broadband to 640,000 people. I think that's concerning. When Democrats in Congress write letters to cable companies asking them to drop Fox News because of the decisions, I think that's concerning. And so I think you've seen from my record a consistent pattern of always basing my decisions at the FCC based on the law, the facts, and the First Amendment. That's what I've done. That's what I'll always do.
Very good. Chair now recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, I've already taken care of ABC. I don't watch them. Mr. Carr, there's $42 billion allocated for connecting people who are not connected to the internet. How many have been connected?
Zero. Through
That's
this
what
$42 billion program, zero.
That's what I thought. Mr. Krikorian, we've taken a lot of heat about not in the House for not taking up the Senate border bill, but wouldn't that have just codified catch and release?
Yes, it would have, and it would have made the border crisis worse by making it more likely that illegal border crossers would end up being released into the United States.
Ms. Mobbs, Wall Street Journal this morning, I want to read you a quote. It says, any delays providing additional supplies of LNG to Ukraine and our Eastern European allies could jeopardize European energy security and market stability in the long term. LNG exports promote geopolitical stability and serve our national security interest. Who do you think said that?
I don't know.
Democrats. There's a letter sent to the Biden administration by no fewer than a dozen House Democrats urging the administration to expedite projects to help Ukraine and investments in the United States. But the most telling thing is Biden officials had hoped to use the pause on LNG exports to excite young progressive voters, and they were using TikTok lobbying campaign on that issue. I find that problematic, considering that we've determined in a bipartisan manner, 100% agreement in the Energy and Commerce Committee that TikTok is a national security threat. Yet the Biden administration used TikTok to launch a lobbying campaign to have a pause on LNG, and it's alienated allies, European allies, who have been counting on the U.S. to reduce their dependence on Russian gas, which still accounts for about 15% of Europe's gas supply. Is that a problem?
I think much of what you just said is a problem, Congressman, to include obviously TikTok being a national security threat, but there were 23 different key actions the Biden administration took that actually encouraged Russia to invade Ukraine. And if I had more time, I would be happy to delineate all 23 different key policy decisions that were much like this one.
Yeah. Mr. Carr, we allocated $7.5 billion to build charging stations. How many have been built?
I believe 8 more than have been built in terms of connections on the internet side. Ms. Gunnar-Sakara, the EPA set up a National Clean Investment Fund. Do you know who heads up that bank? It's basically an investment bank. In your experience at the EPA, how many bankers, investment bankers, did the EPA have on staff?
None that I recall.
Have you looked into the Clean School Bus Program and the grants that have been allocated for that? Have you had a chance to look at that?
Not most recently. I'm familiar with the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, which was a longstanding program actually supported by former boss of mine, Senator Jim Inhofe, and Tom Carper over at Senate EPW, and then culminated into lots of advancements and improvements led by Administrator Wheeler to ensure that we could reduce emissions in areas where there's a ton of idling. But I haven't.
Well, what I'm talking about, though, is that they've set up this investment bank, and they're making grants to nonprofit groups. They're making grants to hub groups. And it concerns me because if you go back to what happened with NIH and the gain of function research, our law clearly prohibits funding for gain of function research, but they'd make grants to a grantee who would then make sub-grants. And I'm concerned about how this is going to be managed at the EPA. I just had an opportunity to have this discussion with the Inspector General of the EPA. He's very concerned about a number of things, and particularly the criminal division of the EPA, but also the fact that they're rushing this money out the door. He cited one instance where a school administration applied for a grant for a clean school bus, and they have no students. Is that a problem?
Yeah, that's a huge problem. And waste, fraud, and abuse through the grant program, especially when an agency like EPA is receiving billions of dollars to be funneled through their grant office, that they're not equipped to handle that degree of taxpayer funds appropriately or responsibly, it creates all sorts of opportunities for nefarious uses.
Okay, on the criminal division, they've bought military-style weapons, military equipment, and yet my Democrat colleagues want to defund the police, but they want to militarize the EPA's criminal division. Is that a problem?
Yeah, I see that as a problem. I would suggest defense resources go towards defense agencies, and that is not within EPA's mission.
Thank you for your answers to all the witnesses. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize Ms. Brown from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm disappointed how this committee is continuing to operate. No solution for the American people. Chaos and confusion and baseless accusations against President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Kamala, like the pronunciation. And I know that we've addressed this multiple times, but it is frustrating to see adults that cannot master the art of pronunciation that was put on display by elementary school-age children. It is disappointing, it is disrespectful, it is disparaging, but it seems like this is the only path that the majority continues to pursue. That is because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do not have a positive agenda. They don't have a plan to increase access to health care. They don't have a plan to protect a woman's right to bodily autonomy. They don't have a plan to protect our climate, Social Security, and Medicare and SNAP access. Democrats, on the other hand, and the Biden-Harris administration have actual plans, not concepts of plans, but real plans. And we have been hard at work delivering on behalf of the American people. Unemployment is at an all-time low. The economy is growing from the middle out. Health care is more affordable than ever, and so much more. Just as one example, under President Biden and Vice President Harris's leadership, we have had the largest investment in the nation's infrastructure in the last 75 years with the bipartisan infrastructure law. Unlike the previous administration, which only talked about Infrastructure Week, but never did anything. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris led the way. Thanks to this historic legislation, bridges, roads, and public transportation systems are receiving the repair, renovation, and renewal they have desperately needed. In my district, the Cleveland RTA received $16 million to renovate stations, making them accessible for seniors and people with disabilities. This will help keep our seniors and those with disabilities independent, connecting them to downtown Cleveland and other areas across Northeast Ohio. Every time I go back to my district, I hear praise for cleaner buses, an electric vehicle station, Metro Parks expansion on the east side, potholes being filled, and new bridges and highways cutting down commute times. Very real acts which benefit people every single day. And these are not acts of God, they are acts of Democrats and the Biden-Harris administration. The Biden-Harris administration also invested $3 billion nationwide to replace lead pipes, ensuring clean water for all. My district alone received $184 million to replace lead pipes. That means fewer kids getting sick from lead poisoning so they can go to school healthy and ready to learn. So, Ms. Perryman, if you could tell us what the success of the the bipartisan infrastructure law meant for families and communities across the country, particularly in low-income communities and Black and brown communities that face the history of unequal treatment.
Well, the act was historic in a number of ways, but that's one of them. Previous infrastructure bills often had overlooked the fact that sometimes when infrastructure is built, it separates communities, it displaces people, particularly people in historically underserved areas. The infrastructure bill actually had provisions that address that very thing, while also empowering and strengthening communities across the country.
Thank you very much. As my colleagues noted, the majority's witnesses are proponents of a certain kind of plan, Project 2025. In fact, some of the Republican witnesses are authors of the plan, and you've heard their testimony. So let me remind all of us, under Project 2025, over 70% of Ohio recipients of Social Security would have their benefits cut by almost $4,000 per year. A family of four would see their taxes raised by over $2,800 per year. Project 2025 would eliminate Head Start, which provides child care and education for over 32,000 Ohio children. Their plan is dangerous, divisive, and downright destructive. I am extremely proud of the Biden-Harris record, and all of our constituents are better off because of it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Before I recognize Mr. Biggs, Mr. Palmer, do you have
Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record the Wall Street Journal editorial this morning demonstrating there are at least a dozen sensible Democrats that are critical of the Biden-Harris natural gas policies.
Without objection, to order. Chair now recognizes Mr. Biggs from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out before I get into my question that unless you have all 8 of those electric vehicles built by NEVI with the $5 billion given to NEVI, in your district, then you've got EVs that are done by the private sector, and that you should acknowledge that, perhaps, maybe, when you're talking about how great they are. So I appreciate the testimony of the witnesses. Mr. Krikorian, thank you for your work. Let's ask you some numbers quickly, Mr. Krikorian, and I want you to let me know if these are accurate in the ballpark. 8 million illegal alien encounters by CBP during the Biden-Harris regime.
Actually, more than that, because that's the southern border. When you count the whole country, it's more than 10 million.
Right. Very good. Southern border. 5.6 million illegal aliens released into the United States by this administration.
As far as I know, yes. They're not very transparent about it, but that's the conclusion we've come to.
1.9 million known gotaways.
Yep.
Myriad number of unknown gotaways.
We don't know what that number is, obviously, because it's unknown.
617,607 illegal aliens released into the country with criminal convictions or pending criminal charges.
I don't have the number in front of me, but yes, I think that's correct.
And in early 2021, the administration tapped Vice President Harris to serve as the administration's border czar. That's not my title. It's not a title manufactured by Republicans. And, Mr. Chairman, I submit an article into the record entitled "Harris to Visit Mexico and Guatemala."
Without objection.
And border czar Kamala Harris often blames the root causes or push factors in Central America for the border crisis. Do you agree with that assessment, Mr. Krikorian?
Those factors are endemic. The reason we had the border crisis is because of the pull factors, the other side, which is to say policies this administration implemented.
So the current commander-in-chief has said that the Border Patrol Union backed the Senate Border Patrol bill, backed the Senate Border Bill, and I want to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, an article that says Border Patrol Union Chief says Biden must quit saying Union backed the border bill.
Without objection, so ordered.
And Mr. Krikorian, the Senate border bill allowed 5,000 individuals to encounters a day before you could even begin to call it an emergency situation. Isn't that true?
Yes, it is.
And then before the president was mandated to take any action, it allowed up to 7,500 people a day. Is that correct?
Yep.
And there were 40 different loopholes, even if the president were to put up a roadblock and say this is an emergency, we're going to stop. There were 40 different loopholes to allow people in.
It was riddled with loopholes, yes.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, I have an article here. The Biden-Harris parole pipeline releases more than 1.3 million migrants into American communities. So over the last 15, and I'd like to admit that to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Over the last 15 months, the CBP One app has let in 813,000 into the country, CBP One app. They don't include those in the encounter figures that they release. Isn't that true, Mr. Krikorian?
It's not included in the border encounter numbers. It is included in the overall
release numbers. Yeah, in the release numbers. And not only that, they also released over 500,000 from the CHNV program, which for folks who don't know what that is, that's the Cuba, Haitian, Nicaragua, and Venezuelan program, which, by the way, they stopped. You remember that when they stopped that for 2 weeks? Why did they stop that, Mr. Krikorian? Do you remember?
Because of widespread fraud on the part of supposed sponsors, because the people are supposed to have a sponsor, and so there were like multiple fake addresses, fake sponsors, hundreds of people sponsored by the same person, that kind of fraud.
Yeah, they said they had more than 12,000 cases of fraud, and they took 2 whole weeks to look at it, and then they reignited the program. So let's talk about some other impacts. Jerome Powell. Anybody know who Jerome Powell is? Federal Reserve Chair, right? He suggested just the other day that the influx of migration is contributing to rising unemployment. I'd like to submit that for the record, please, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
I'd like to submit another article for the record. This one says CBP One application migrants are released into the United States, no asylum questions asked.
Without objection.
Yeah, and then we get to the end of this, and the border, having just been to the border once again, just 2 weeks ago, I can tell you, folks, it continues to be wide open, and this administration drives that. They're providing every incentive in the world. They love an open border. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Crockett from Texas.
Thank you so much. You know what, this hearing is actually the best example of what waste, fraud, and abuse looks like, because the only reason we're having this hearing is because somebody got their feelings hurt in a debate, and I don't understand why we're wasting taxpayer dollars. Next time, tell your big boy to show up and be ready to handle the woman in the room who hopefully will become the next president of the United States. Nevertheless, while we do have two amazing authors from projects, it seems like I'm gonna make sure I also say that it ain't our homeboys thing, because we know that it doesn't poll very well with the American people, because the American people are woke enough to recognize that there is nothing good in it for them. So with that being said, Ms. Perryman, I'm just curious, and this is yes or no. Is Trump's name ever mentioned in Project 2025? Yes or no? Just yes or no. I got you.
Within the document itself,
Yes.
there are a number of references to the former administration.
So is Trump's name mentioned just one time?
I believe it's mentioned more.
Okay. 5 times.
I haven't counted.
Oh, okay. Well, if I told you that his name is mentioned approximately 312 times, would you have any reason to dispute that?
I don't have any reason.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's interesting that we want to try to pretend. We're not going to pretend in here. We're going to work with facts and not fiction. So I also want to talk about inflation really quickly with you, Ms. Perryman, because we've talked about it a lot. I'm just curious to know, is the inflation that we just struggled through, was that global or was that limited to the United States?
Global.
Global. Seemingly, it was attached to this thing called the global pandemic. Is that correct?
That is my understanding.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't just the United States.
No.
Okay, so it wasn't just a matter of the Biden-Harris administration in the United States is struggling, right?
I think the United States actually fared better than the rest of the world.
Oh, yeah. In fact, we are, correct?
I think so, yeah.
All right, but inflation still hurts, and so that's why we have a candidate that has an actual plan instead of concepts of a plan. Or as I like to say, Trump only has offered concepts of constitutionality mixed with coordinations of a coup. But nevertheless, we're going to move on. I want to talk about the internet really quickly, because we wanted to talk about the internet. Actually, let me talk about the border real fast, and then we can talk about Texas in this way. I'd ask for unanimous consent to emit this article from The Hill that says, Trump says, blame it on me if border bill fails.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to move on to the internet, and I'm actually going to talk about Texas, because I believe that the testimony has been somewhere around the fact that no money has actually been disputed as it relates to rural broadband. I'd also ask for unanimous consent to admit this article from the USDA.gov. USDA officials attend groundbreaking to expand high-speed internet access in rural Texas, dated March 7th, 2024, Italy, Texas.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you so much.
With respect, that was not the testimony.
Oh, I thought you said no dollars had been spent.
The largest single program.
My question is, did you not say?
$42 billion.
Okay.
0 houses have been connected. There are other federal programs, including Trump-era ones, that right now are turning dirt and connecting.
Okay, so just to be clear, because I don't want the American people to be confused, because I was confused, because it almost seemed as if, considering the fact the name of this hearing is the failed policies, as if nothing had been done. But to clarify for those that are watching, you aren't saying that no dollars have been spent as it relates to rural broadband dollars under the Infrastructure Act, correct?
To be clear, for the signature effort, $42
Yes or
billion,
no? Have any dollars been spent?
not a
$1.
single person has been connected. There's
That's
other
not my
programs,
question, though. My
but they
question
have their
was,
own
have
sets
any?
of issues. Senator Ted Cruz from
Okay,
Texas
I'm
put out
going to
a
move on.
report
I'm going to
to
move
show
on.
that
I'm reclaiming my time at this point.
many of these
I'm
bills, it's
reclaiming my time, which means,
$100,000
Chairman, I'm going to
per
ask you to
location.
stop my time, because the witness is not.
Are you asking him a question, or are you?
No, I'm
reclaiming
not
your
asking
time?
him a question. I reclaim my time.
All right. Chair recognizes Ms. Crockett.
Okay, now I was at 41, y'all, so go back up.
We'll give
I
you
was
9
watching.
more seconds.
Okay, thank you so much.
Here's the deal. You've testified a lot about the problem with the broadband rollout being diversity, equity, and inclusion. You said DEI, I don't know how many times, which is one of the issues that Project 2025 takes issue with. But it's interesting to me because I have another article from the Texas Tribune, and it actually specifically states that internet providers say they are simultaneously hopeful and skeptical about whether the incoming federal dollars will be enough to connect the most underserved Texans. Historically, other federal rural broadband funding programs have seen limited success because many companies who committed to providing broadband went into default after radically underestimating their cost. It doesn't say anything about diversity. And the final thing that I will say
Do you
is
know why
that
those
this
costs have
election,
increased
I didn't ask you a
substantially?
question. The final thing that I will say is that this election is the best example of why y'all are so afraid of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because then you can't have a simple-minded, underqualified white man somehow end up ascending. Instead, you've got to pay attention to the qualified black woman that is on the other side. And with that, I will yield.
Gentlelady yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Mobbs, you served in uniform, didn't you, as I recall?
That is correct.
Yeah, thank you for your service. So I think you know or are aware that in the last few years, the U.S. military across all branches have had a struggle in recruiting and meeting their goals. And in answer to that, this administration has revised the targets or the goals downward. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
And I think we're on the precipice of being at the lowest point in the Army, which is where I served, and thank you for your service, ma'am, of being at Army recruiting levels or sustainment levels that are akin to pre-World War II, 1939 and 1940, right?
That is correct, yes.
You served, I served, but I think it's better you're the witness here. Why do you suppose that is? Why is the military having a difficult time recruiting?
Well, thank you for your service, sir. I appreciate it as well. I think this is for a variety of reasons, and I actually testified on this very topic before a subcommittee here. It is for a variety of reasons, but one of the major reasons it's often cited is there is morale issues. There's both morales with recruitment, but there's also issues with retention. But then broadly speaking, the American populace is not necessarily prepared to serve, and this is across a variety of different factors to include their mental health, their physical well-being, and then their patriotism. The Wall Street Journal did a fantastic poll that showed patriotism is significantly declining over time in our country. And because of that, young Americans don't necessarily feel like they are willing to put on a uniform to fight and die for our country.
Are there any actions that the military itself is taking from a policy standpoint that you think might dissuade? And I say that because we are trying to look at the differences between two or administrations or the different philosophies among administrations. And I appreciate the gentlelady that was just speaking, but the hearing is kind of about some of the failures so we can do better. I don't know that she really defended any of the policies of the current administration as much as she derided the policies, potential policies of a future administration, which does not yet exist, but if you know of any.
Well, I think in general that this administration has more focused on initiatives related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I think the problem with that is it derives from the core function of our military, which is lethality. Ultimately, the responsibility of the military is to fight and win our nation's wars, and that requires the necessity of unification regardless of your background, walk of life, your demographics. There has to be a belief in both the unit that you're serving in and that the broader apparatus has that unifying factor together. I think, unfortunately, this administration has focused a little bit more exclusively than the previous administration on doing things that highlight individuality, and the one place you cannot have individuality is our United States military.
And would you agree with me that the uniform military service, if you break that down, uniform is one form, not many forms, but it is one form. And as you so stated, the policies of the current administration celebrate the individual, which is great for certain walks of life, but in the military, in the uniform military services, you must put some of those personal things aside so that you can be one cohesive unit, and not doing so is an impediment to recruiting and retention.
Absolutely, and I think the military for a long period of time often remained one of the last bastions of meritocracy. There was the opportunity to compete, and if you were successful, irrespective of your background, your demographic, if you were the best, then you were promoted and you were put into positions of greater leadership and power, and that is something extraordinarily beautiful. It's a pathway to the middle class, it's an opportunity from those all around our country to serve in uniform, and it allowed them to achieve things that they may not have been able to achieve otherwise without the military. Unfortunately, some of those standards have been reduced, and when there is a focus instead of not on a meritocracy or achievement, but rather meeting quota systems, you unfortunately have an erosion of the belief that the military is that bastion of meritocracy where you can go in, and if you are the best, you'll be promoted.
Thank you. I would agree with that. I yield the balance.
Thank you. Chairman, yield back. Gentleman now.